Brilliant. So, firstly, I'd like to introduce someone who classically, of course, needs no introduction, Jeremy Moody, who has been the Secretary and Advisor to the Central Association of Agricultural Valuers since 1995, and has been on the scene advising government and so on for some time before that. So we're very privileged to have him come along and talk about what the opportunities look like for new entrants, and also for the people who potentially have new entrants as tenants, and what sort of different maybe future agreements could look like between landowners and tenants. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Jeremy to start first to unmute and then share his screen for his presentation. Hopefully this is a moment when it all unravels, but hopefully this time we'll have a yeah, here we come. This is all looking very good. And Jeremy's going to speak for about 20 minutes, and then we'll open up for discussion and questions and so on. Thanks very much. Over to you, Jeremy.
Well, thanks very much indeed. Thanks for the kind introduction, and indeed the benefit of a year's worth of experience at trying to do things on Zoom to get this far. So, but hoping this is useful, I shall try to honour your injunctions not to talk about the scheme, not to discuss anything particularly political, but to try and pave the way for the discussion that you want afterwards, looking at why there might be opportunities, something around the shape of those opportunities, and the kind of issues that people will have in looking and making the best of those opportunities. You kindly introduced me with my role, assuming this works. Yes, it does. The CAAV, as you said, the Specialist Professional Association for those acting, advising farmers and owners, and indeed others, and you mentioned our work with government, representing briefing and qualifying agricultural valuers across the whole United Kingdom, qualifying by examination. And we're very much, our interest in all of this is to look at practicality on the ground, not arguing any particular interest, but actually what's going to work, and so that members can give the right advice to each client. And we're looking at what's coming through as a very considerable period of change, and with change opportunity. It's one of those moments when the kaleidoscope is turned and we look to see how the patterns fall out and come through. The drivers of change are fairly well rehearsed in many places, but nonetheless, just to start this on this slide, people look at the moment, the occasion of Brexit, and obviously in England, the withdrawal of basic payment that's now started, the prospect of that happening in Wales as well, and further changes elsewhere in the United Kingdom. But that's merely one part of the picture, however much it may be an immediate and proximate driver for change among the people for whom BPS is particularly important. We have the pressures from climate change and more precisely on many farmers, the measures taken to mitigate it. We suspect very substantial impact on rural land management over the next decade, the wider issue around environmental goals, biodiversity, and so on. But there's also the entire new world being opened up by technological innovation. There is this revolution going on in the technologies available to agriculture. And one of the interesting things, talking with some of the people who are involved in this, agriculture poses the technicians in this task more problems that if they can tackle them and solve them, then they can do it for almost anybody else. What it takes for the robotics of picking a strawberry is sufficiently remarkable that it'll help with everything from medicine through to manufacturing. Changes in markets, more open international markets, greater competition, but also changing domestic markets, changing public appetites, and again, innovation there and responding to that and doing so effectively. And a theme I'll pick up as I go through these is the pressure that brings for a shift from, not completely from by any means, but a shift of emphasis away from commodity production. And then over and above this, of course, is regulation coming in for its own various motives. But to crystallize that, it could be summarized as a generation's change in a decade, one of those moments, and we haven't seen perhaps for towards a century, when very substantial changes happen, and in who is farming what and where and how. we have the generation's worth of area payments being phased out, and the generation's process of reaching net zero, again, as I suggested, having its impact on us, particularly in this first decade on the run to 2050. And there's a model in this that we've seen with what happened to manufacturing in the 1980s. Complacent, arguably, a high cost base, lower value, not really always keeping up with the world. And farming does have a cost structure like a manufacturing business, though on the whole now very much smaller businesses, equally exposed to international exchange rates. And manufacturing in the 80s was pretty literally put through the mill. And we are now the world's 9th largest manufacturing nation because we skilled the workforce, we shifted into higher productivity areas of work, we used the technology, and we invested in research and development. There are some lessons in that for all of us as we look at where we are going to go. And in that, to come nearer to the theme then for today, the critical questions around this, and indeed summarizing the productivity challenge, is the who of farming and the how of farming. And today is very largely about the who. Who is going to come into farming? Who is going to go out? Is that succession by generation in the family or outside? And how is that process facilitated where it's the right answer? It'll fall to the who will have occupation and use of land, to then look at the how, what they produce, the farm structures, the technology, the marketing, and the land use changes. And particularly looking at CAAV members, it's then how we assist in managing those changes well so that everybody achieves the best out of it that they can. Because access to land, and this is the Irish government speaking, but they face issues very similar to the ones that we have. Access to land, low level of land mobility, land there turns over about once every 500 years, is a growing consensus, the use of land, not the ownership of land, that is a real issue here. And the analysis that they did points to the real gains in farming performance. And we are looking at farming being much more exposed to competitive pressures come from getting it into the hands of the proficient. This is the area far more than anything about age. So how to open those markets? We're not looking at changing ownership. There are many reasons why people might wish to own farmland, rural land, but how to get the right people to use it. And bearing in mind, of course, few other sectors in the economy substantially rely on owned premises for them to run their businesses. So what's going to encourage owners facing pressures and not feeling that they're going to master them? What's going to encourage them to make their land available to others? How do we find the approach and the language that helps them to see that as a positive thing to do with value and virtue, that gives them quite probably a better financial return than they may now be getting, that sees their land managed well, giving them confidence in all of this, while wanting to protect their family assets, with tax obviously being a particularly acute feature among others in that. And of course, looking outside that, the new non-farming owners, where they buy in the countryside, they will have bought for their own reasons. The land still needs to be used, maintained, and managed. It's by no means necessarily true that we're going to buy a commodity growth, and it's looking at what will earn a margin, added value, and of course this is where we begin to break the link with scale of land occupation in looking at this. Scaling speciality rather than area will be the commercial challenge for those people. It's easy to do something special at a very small scale, but can you do it to achieve a full income? And at the other end, it probably now towards a third of our farm output by value now comes from under some form of cover, whether it's the poultry buildings, the pig buildings, areas of horticulture, and other aspects. It tots up to quite a lot in terms of the value of output if we're looking at where the weight of farming value might lie. And then the questions, are you looking to add value to capital or to income, out of data, with soils, all those other issues around this, perhaps we pick up a little more in questions. And of course, now the new questions, relatively new, but being posed in words that we're beginning to find our way through, about looking at the environment as an enterprise. We have the public money for public goods, but then actually we're also here looking at people who might be selling public goods. So where is the deal? Where is the balancing point between them? What is the price? Where does that run with productive farming? Where is it instead of or alongside less profitable farming? And the synergies with other businesses, and working our way through this, but the opportunities of environmental management through agricultural means as one of the commercial aspects of the world we're moving into. And so this has led us as an association to look quite hard at these matters, to help members review businesses and land use. And they're just different ways of looking through the prism at the prospects for change coming. Looking at a business, quizzing its accounts, quizzing its resources, its weaknesses, looking at where it wants to be in 10 years' time, perhaps one of the core questions in all of this. And then, of course, how that works through in terms of what does that do to rural land use? Now we're outside the CAP and indeed the previous payment structures, all of which tended to channel where uses would be. So time to review and act, review the business, and I come back to that question, where do you realistically want to be in 10 years' time? Because the task now is to find the best way there, but that review has to be an honest review. We're not at a time, I think, when those most in need of review can stand that many illusions. Understanding the pressures, you can raise performance, you can look at your enterprise choice or other business, or come to where we are today and see structural change, retirement, or reduction of scale or withdrawal. But this is all part of the process of managing change rather than letting change manage you, whether you're trying to come in or indeed you're trying to go out. And so we have the whole that range of issues that I've touched on here as to what people might want to do. But for the purpose of a 20-minute talk, I can suggest we perhaps see 5 broad strands in how land comes to be used in this. More food production under cover. So that's everything from controlled environment farming through to parts of horticulture, indoor dairying and livestock. We will have those focused commercial commodity farmers who will need scale in order to reduce unit cost. They will take land that helps that. They will not take land that will not. And we're seeing those processes of adjustment going on now. The land they release could be useful to other people and indeed begin to fit into the scheme that we're talking about today. Businesses that built on land and farming, but then add value. And that probably is going to be one of the growth areas in some ways, again, returning to where the farming economy was before we came in with large-scale government schemes. Land management, but perhaps for other objectives, but using agricultural means. And that probably is going to be the largest part of how we deal and meet environmental ends and climate change. And then beyond that, some environmental land management, just pure and simple. So the opportunities, and we're looking at new access for people, the people this scheme is looking to serve, to land and to business. And you can, in a sense, see them as slightly different aspects. If you're wanting access to land, a tenancy, or indeed a grazing license, equivalent arrangement, is for your business. Quite often, though, a lot of what gets discussed and sometimes is regarded possibly even as innovative is looking at how you could work with somebody else. The flexible structures for access to a business that you put together between you, whether existing farmers working together or a new entrant finding their way in. We have very solid models out there in combinable cropping and breeding livestock for looking at how we provide farming services to another business. The whole enterprise stubble contracting at one end, down to a contract for hoof trimming at the other end. But coming into combined ventures, and this classically seen perhaps for newer entrants or people progressing in farming, looking at this in the dairy sector, where an owner of a farm and somebody bringing dairy skills to it join in a company, and then the company is the vehicle that is their joint venture between them, whereby they then put the money, effort, and investment in and draw their return and reward from it. But that gets to an underlying point that's critical right the way through this entire subject. We're talking about business, but we're really talking about people. These are agreements with and between people. Everything I'm talking about will only work if by having the good relationships underneath it between people who are handling risk in the hope of reward. And those are key messages in this. So here are a couple of publications we did a year ago around contracting, helping people look at whole business, whole enterprise contracting, breeding livestock on the right and arable farming on the left, working up the models by which this can be done. Interestingly, in the breeding livestock, a number of models in Scotland, whereby the contractor can turn the reward into building a larger herd or flock as part of their way through accumulating and building the capital that takes them on to larger enterprises. We need not be talking just about entry. Entrants need to progress if they're going to be part of the kind of vibrant farming future we're looking for. So core questions, and this really perhaps is the central slide of it all. What is the business deal? Because that's what they're setting their hand to. Does it actually work? Have they really thought about it? Test the links, because that will drive the agreement, and that will come with a label. Indeed, here possibly 2 of them. And that's the relationship between the parties. And it's a mutual relationship which needs to stand the pressure. And they've then got to be people who can see that as mutual and not as interference. So who's putting money in? Money in investment? Does it need fixed investment? Who's providing it and on what terms? And then in order of difficulty, how are you going to deal with the profits? Greed. And the crunch, how are you going to deal with losses? Because the years go up and the years go down, and dividing losses is the surest test of almost every relationship you can look at. And then right at the beginning, when looking at this, how might this end? Does it end on death? Does it end after 5 years? Does it end when somebody needs to move on, as a new entrant might then need to progress and let somebody else in? What happens at the end? Is there compensation where the new entrant has invested, whether as a tenant or indeed as a contractor or in some other joint venture? And you come back to the honest question of honest perception. Are the expectations of the two parties shared? Are they reasonable? So look at the agreements. And I've said the deal drives the agreement, not the other way around. Don't just reach for an agreement off the shelf, treating it like a talisman or something that we tick a box. We've got an agreement, that's great. You need to find the agreement that's appropriate to the deal and then tailor it. The fortune we have now is that very often we've learnt how we don't involve land in these schemes, so the landowner and his family needn't get too troubled that this is a bid for control of the land. This is about the business, it's about income, reward and risk. Look at this as a chance to bring and create value. The risk we see, whether people bidding for tenancies or indeed in many contract farming arrangements, is you see the tenant or the contractor volunteering to transfer value. Stay with the former, create value and bring it with your skill, with your timeliness, with your machinery. And then record the agreement in writing. And again, don't just use a template. Test the concepts, work your way through, record what the parties are actually going to do when left alone, because that's the way they want to behave, but it needs to be in ways that are safe and help deliver their goals. And if it's an agreement for any period of time, because it's a relationship, because circumstances are changing so much, build in a review mechanism, reviewing the rent or terms in a tenancy, a farming policy, and the meetings that come with a good contracting arrangement. And quite often, particularly in those joint ventures, have somebody independent who can hold the ring, to whom you can refer, be a safe challenger, but actually a point of perspective to keep people on the saner side of reality. Very often, people who are thinking that they might not want, they would talk of retirement, and then you come to the litany of excuses. Well, we might, in the slides just gone, have cracked the issue about what will I earn. But housing then frequently comes up, and this here is a text that prompted by the Prince of Wales put together, reviewing a lot of these themes. But we have answers here, and the planning in England makes it particularly available, the opportunity of a house in open country, for someone taking majority control of the farm business, Para 79 of the National Planning Policy Framework. But very often, this is talked about as housing for the retiring farmer. Very often the retiring farmer wants to retire to the house he's always lived in. This is as substantively a question about the farm, any housing need of the new farmer as of the old. And so it's looking at that positively and looking at the ways, again, in which value can be created and the right arrangements put in place as we go through this. So there is a picture, but just to close, just looking at the new land users, because this is an area which does attract its share of sentimentality, of dewy-eyed vision. And actually, we are looking at a period of robust and challenging change. We're looking at new businesses entering a sector which is going to become more diverse and more varied as we go through this. It's going to call on skills that are more than the engineering skills of being a farmer, as perhaps known as a farmer's engineer in this. So new entrants, they can be of any age and background. Indeed, people who've had other business lives, bring capital and business experience, are perfectly in the frame for this. A lot in this is about character, determination and resilience. Wrestling with nature and earning an income and building a business do demand grit. But it's the skills beyond the farm gate in business, being able to look the bank manager competently in the eye. It's in marketing, if you're looking to add value, particularly. Skills with people, if it's a people-based business you're going through. So it's not just about being good with livestock or particularly having an aptitude of machinery. It is looking at something more, because this is about business. access to capital is always very considerable help in this. There's some of the ways I've talked through do manage to leverage other people's capital. But fundamentally, and to close, thinking my 20 minutes are about there and discussion is needed, it's the ability to handle not just a step change that I think we're facing, but getting onto an escalator. We're looking at a world of restless change. Markets are by definition restless markets. We're looking at this and that attitude to risk, a shift in the needle on that balance between risk and stability, and the people who can manage, master, and deliver on that are the people who will be the successful new entrants, who will bring reward to those people who make land and opportunities available to them. So hoping I've said one or two things that might stimulate some discussion. I hope that was a 20 minutes that served Henry's purpose. I should now hope that others will now intervene and take the discussion forward. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jeremy. That was very stimulating, and certainly, hopefully, has given a lot of food for thought. Now, if you can put your hand up electronically, hopefully, if you want to talk, hopefully we've had Zoom around long enough for people to be able to do that. And I'll call people, I'll unmute you and call you forward. There is I saw a comment from Graham from CPRE, and so I might ask him to he put the comment first, ask him just to ask his question first.
Yeah, I'm happy to. Can you hear me, Henry?
Absolutely.
Yeah, happy to ask. Thanks, Jeremy. Really interesting presentation. I suppose my question was driven by your comparison with the 1980s and a very difficult period for many people, a lot of structural change, but that, of course, was partly driven by great number of redundancies and people being left actually not helped to skill up and change and modernize, but actually just be made unemployment, which helped drive the structural changes, different working practices. I just wonder whether you, if we were looking pessimistically, do you see the kind of changes to farming going forward, cuts to BPS, etc., driving a similar sort of hemorrhaging of people out of farming to enable the change you're talking about and that new sort of positive workforce coming in?
I think that depends very much on how we handle it, and that's the importance of discussions like this now. I mean, I remember right at the beginning of the 80s, the concern that what was being done was needed to be done, but did industry actually have the resilience within itself to handle it? And farming classically is a very resilient sector. The capacity to endure is enormous, but it's looking to put a positive spin on this. I think that I would turn one thing in your remarks around, not that high levels of unemployment and redundancy drove the process of restructuring. They were the working out of the restructuring. Mm-hmm. And it demonstrated that actually you shouldn't necessarily look at economic activity as justified by employment. If manufacturing chemicals was to be internationally competitive, it relied on actually as highly skilled and a smaller number of people doing the job. But I think we are looking at some change in the models here. The lessons to be learned are about acquiring skills, and the international comparisons the AHDB shows put sectors of British agriculture on a poor basis compared with international competitors in terms of formal training. And formal training is part of the group of people who will be the proficient. I mean, practical skills earn practically part of that as well. But I think an AHDB figure is of the people managing farms under 35, about half have formal training. In Holland, it's about 84%. Holland has achieved 3.5% year-on-year productivity improvement. We've achieved 0.9%, and actually less in this century. Skills, innovation, investment, and structural change are the ways in which this moves forward.
Thanks for that. Yeah, I understand those figures and agree with you on that need for training and business planning, particularly, and benchmarking and so forth. And
this is where I think we come back to the need for people to look honestly at themselves. There's a nasty aside, if you like, in one of the Anderson's HDB papers around people in the bottom quartile tending to think they're above average.
That's like drivers, isn't it?
Absolutely, it's what every wife will tell you.
Absolutely. Okay, David Radcliffe, can you?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Henry. Thank you, Jeremy. A brilliant presentation, I thought, to be honest. I just wanted to see what your thoughts were. Obviously, land matching partnerships and schemes have been tried in the past, but I know, and some people are of the view that, you know, these things, people find themselves and sort themselves out. But I was just interested to hear your thoughts, whether you thought, you know, a scheme like this in England would be great with, you know, with technology, you know, the technology obviously improving now and different ways and means of matching farmers, whether this is something that would be a great success or something that might not really work out.
You had, I think, last time John McAllister from Northern Ireland speaking, and he is running what appears to be an increasingly active land matching service there, where there's a lot of interest from young people and others coming in. And but I think the real answer to your question comes back to changing the mindset. It is that entering this sort of arrangement is seen as something positive by the people who have land. A lot of the discussion tends to revolve around estates. But the kind of pressures I've outlined are as much the smaller and medium-sized owner-occupier as with estates. You know, all people, ultimately all people with land are in the frame for this. But it's changing the mindset so that this is seen as something that it is reasonable and rational for somebody with land to do, that is not a betrayal of ancestors, that it retains family property in good order. I think all those, again, are part of it. And like a lot of things we're having to do at the moment, it is about language. There will be parts of language in this. As you say, very often, markets can have a means of finding people. Land matching has been tried some time ago, and what it produced was many more people asking than offering. And that was a mismatch. And quite a lot of people who were wanting opportunities who weren't skilled enough to be taken. It's possible that circumstances have moved on from that. And I think some of the things that the Fresh Start people are talking about at the moment possibly see more people willing to offer opportunities, and with luck, better trained people coming forward for them. So it's possible, but it's part of a larger picture.
All right, thank you very much. Thank you, lovely.
Yes, I think, Jeremy, it was interesting that I think the main message from John McAllister is it wasn't land matching, it was people matching, which I think is exactly the same point you're making, isn't it? Yes. That it's people and relationships first, it's the mechanics second.
Yeah, the chemistry between the people involved in any of these relationships, and that includes landlord-tenant or indeed owner and grazier, they need to like, they need to trust each other, they need to respect each other. They need, if the world turns turtle, to be able to turn round and reappraise afresh. Just simply as an example from some time ago, we had once a very dry year, and in this particular context, somebody drafted a tenancy with they'd gone what they thought was a sensible turnover-based approach to rent, but it was geared to the price of wheat. The price of wheat went through the roof, but yields went through the floor. The rent would have gone to 280 odd pounds an acre. That was clearly unrealistic in the circumstances, whatever it was driven, whatever the agreement actually said. And both landlord and tenant sat down and said, that's a very silly answer. What should the answer be? And they worked their way through it from there. And you need that ability for the relationship to stand, that willingness to reappraise, because people need these relationships to continue. Even if it's something where people are expecting to move on, they need the continuity to be able to do that. And that question of managing the relationship, that two people can get along, equally, they could find the other irritating, they could find the other interfering. You know, this is a common reason for wanting a tenancy rather than a joint venture, is that I'm captain of my own ship in a tenancy. Its boundaries are defined by my agreement, and I run my business and I'm accountable for it. A joint venture is joint. That, in a small p sense, is a partnership. That is something that people need to be right for.
Brilliant. Rob, can you?
Unmute myself. There we go.
That's it. Great.
No, I noted, Jeremy, you talked about, joint ventures, and it is about finding the right people. And, I have some very successful ones where they've brought young people in really to do the work, and have ended up with a big equity stake, which has been fantastic. They're buying farms. So, but I did notice, one of the things about joint ventures is they're obviously brilliant for capital taxes, and they've been driven, as you say, by large estates who are following the Balfour ruling 10 or 15 years ago, sort of all gone down that route. And to my mind, they're easier to manage from a new entrant's perspective, because you've got more control over that sort of variable rent. You can relate that directly to profit rather than trying to negotiate rents. And I suppose the joint venture approach is generally you find the right people and they get together, whereas the landlord tenant seems to be, the landlord advertises, all sorts of people put in a ridiculous tender and somebody gets it. But you're then stuck at that rate. And I do wonder whether the variable sort of approach to the reward for the landlord, i.e. through a joint venture rather than a straight tenancy, is one of the big attractions for new entrants. And that whole sort of, how you pay for the land and how you calculate that is actually one of the things that stops new entrants getting in, or maybe landlords even taking a chance on newer entrants, where we should have more sort of lead in, or more variable rents, or more, if we can grow this business, you get more, but actually if I start on a low scale, you'll only get this. And that, whether that can be rolled out more wildly. And I know you, on a separate thing, I know you said that farmers are quite resilient, which you might rephrase as comfortable, in that, there's an awful lot of people who are not very productive, owning vast swathes of land, which would be better used by somebody else, as you've pointed out, but actually encouraging them to make the leap and let somebody else use it seems nigh on impossible.
Yeah, and I think that's the change in mindset issue, and it's one of the things why I'm looking very positively at the use of an income tax relief in the Republic of Ireland, which has changed people who would never ever have let land outside the family into landlords on some scale, and it's what will catalyse that change in mindset. And I was reflecting as I was putting these slides together, contract farming, as you've described, which is, of course, actually as much as anything, a way round the old tenancy law, which is where people grew into it in the early 80s. And I remember people looking askance at the early contract farming agreements. How would you ever trust, how would you ever be sure that your grain was correctly recognised in the bins of the contractor? Surely he would always put his land first and you would lose on timeliness. And all those things were said, and then it worked. And then people got confident. And it has spread in the way that you've described, particularly in combinable cropping. Another part, because there's quite a lot in what you've said. One of the comments I remember from the discussions that led to the breeding livestock contract farming paper, and that was very much in part driven by circumstances in Scotland, and again, the particular issues around the tenanted sector there, was that the kind, and this isn't, if you like, a new entrant point, but it's just a broader point, the kind of people who are willing to come forward and regard themselves as interested in and suitable for contract farming arrangements at enterprise level, or were almost self-defining as being more enterprising, because they were coming to what was a business proposition with the business approach. And yes, that could well be tenants that would come in and want to take on an additional contracting operation, but there would be tenants who would not wish to do that, who would regard that as too risky and something not to venture on. So there's an element of self-selection in this, in who comes forward. I think the point about a properly run contracting agreement is you probably really do need a recognizable level of scale. And I tend always to reach for 200 acres, but that's clearly just a sort of moral figure. To run it properly, to run the accounting, to carry sort of the surrounds of this. If you've got 25 acres to put out, then a tenancy is probably the easiest and cheapest way to do it, unless there's a very high value activity going on. So you've got there was another point I was going to come back on, but we probably better let the discussion run, and I'll recall it later.
Okay, thanks. I haven't got any more hands up. I have a couple of questions in the comments. Is there a need for business skills training and support for new entrants to enable them to thrive? I think you've sort of talked about that already. And John just mentioned, isn't the majority of Holland's farming undercover and intensive?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of it is. I mean, quite a lot of it though is quite a lot of it is quite small scale in terms of the people growing potatoes and so on. There, it's a different structure from how we've done it. But yeah, you could satirize Holland and say it's successfully turned itself into a greenhouse. Going to do it simply, but that's where it's delivering quite a formidable powerhouse of agricultural value. And quietly, we've been going back to my observations about the value of output coming from undercover. We've been doing chunks of that. When I last looked, the value of output from the poultry sector was about the same as the value of output from the combinable cropping sector. And of course, an awful lot of our grain is simply going into our poultry now. We are doing our bit that way without necessarily recognizing it very much. And that, of course, is the other point, perhaps generally to pick out about new entrants coming in, is they're always coming in by the next route, not the one that you've seen. And if you want those other routes to enter up, and if you want some optimism in this, we in the CAAV have now, since the late 1970s, done an annual survey of decisions about occupying land. So it was to see what happened when tenancies ended, or where they were granted, and we've gone a bit broader than that since. But one of the consistent features, despite all anecdotage, is that of the situations where land is let to somebody who wasn't the previous tenant, it's a fairly consistent 20 to 30% are let to somebody seen as a new entrant. The willingness to let to new entrants is there. The problem we face is the lack of opportunities. And it's creating the mindset that creates those opportunities. We'll then see new entrants competing with all others for the land, but possibly with fewer preconceptions, better able to do it. That does come back to the point then, perhaps to get this one in now, responding again to Rob, which is that it's not only people bidding for tenancies who sometimes bid unrealistically. Coming back to my point about, are you bringing value with your skill and competence and machinery and the rest, or are you transferring value? And I will see that just as much in contracting arrangements, where the contractor will, in order to bid, will bid as optimistically as any would-be tenant. And again, being honest and clear-sighted about that, I think, is one of those things that we are probably going to have to think quite hard about. And then that gets just taking the opportunity in the absence of questions to come back more on
We've
Rob.
got another question.
Well, let me just deal with this last point for Rob while the questions crystallize. The willingness of the landowner to accept that his first charge will fall or disappear completely in a bad year comes back to my test of people's willingness to carry losses. There is something of a predisposition in some landowners to want the upside of a deal without necessarily thinking that they want to accept the downside risks. And I think it comes back to testing that. If the deal is struck such that in a hard year nobody gets money, that's more likely to be a robust one than when there is an absolutely minimum first charge. But you found another question.
Urine, is that right? Sorry, you're on mute.
Aaron, you're muted.
Am I unmuted now?
You're very unmuted now.
Thank you, Henry, and thank you, Jeremy, for a stimulating presentation as ever. I do have a question, but a quick observation, if I may, before I go on to that. As you know, we've had experience of a matching service in Wales as well. I'm sorry I wasn't able to join the previous presentation about Northern Ireland. But to my absolute surprise, the imbalance in Wales turned to be the exact opposite of what we expected, in that actually there was a greater number of providers than seekers. The reasons for that, I think, are not terribly well understood and a little surprising, but it probably relates to the attitude of some of the seekers in terms of how willing they were to travel and how flexible they might be in terms of what they might wish to take on. But hopefully that might be of interest. But my question is, mindful that this is facilitated by government, or acknowledging the PERDA and so on, in your view, where is the market failure in all of this?
Sorry, just to come back on your earlier remarks, I think you have made an important aside, and it's an economy-wide aside about people's willingness to travel. There is, and again, it is something that has puzzled analysts across the economy. And the nearest thing I've seen to an answer in commentary on it is that it's a function of a society with an older average age, is that it tends to colour everybody's attitudes and make them less mobile. You think back to previous generations, particularly in the 19th century, when people pushed off to Australia or Canada at the drop of a hat. And there's a lot less of that. Getting people to look for an opportunity outside the county can be quite challenging. John McAllister will find that in Northern Ireland. Yes, they want opportunities, but they don't necessarily want to travel for them. So again, how enterprising are people, and you get part of that. The change, the market failure, I think, firstly, you can pin it on, I think you can genuinely pin it on BPS. We spent some time in those annual land occupation surveys I mentioned, we spent some time as we wore on towards 2010 and on, seeing a collapse of activity and little movement, stasis in the marketplace for new lettings, having had really quite a vibrant 6 years or so, 7 years after after tenancy reform in '95. And the easy answer, because everybody always wants to pin it on inheritance tax, was to look for something in inheritance tax. And the puzzle was that there hadn't been anything in inheritance tax to drive that change. Nothing had changed the waters. And what became clear as the 1 year followed another was that actually, if you pay people by the area they occupy, that freezes the relationships. And they just stay there because I've got the right number of entitlements to hold on my land. So the argument about BPS as a drag on the system, at least in both the United Kingdom and in Ireland, and that gets you to some interesting questions about continental countries then, looks to be a good argument. It has provided more comfort than it has provided support in that sense. But that's, if you like, is a negative, or at least this is what the government might be testing. Simply removing BPS on that argument is a necessary but not a sufficient cause for change. The capacity, going back to the argument earlier on about resilience, for people to hunker down, absorb the pain, is not to be underrated. And one thing I think that's incumbent on us as advisors, and other people there, is to try and see how far we can move the balance towards people making and taking positive opportunities, and less around hunkering down and taking the pain. And I think some of this is, Henry's flag may well shine lights in ways that help people see things they didn't otherwise see. As I said, I find it quite persuasive with what's happened in the Irish Republic around the use of income tax relief on arm's length letting. That, from a standing start in a country where to be a landlord would make you English, in people who are more generations on their land than many people here would recognize, that's seeing them make family land available in ways that are useful, such that there are now, from 2015, there are now 11,000 landlords, and it looks like 8% of the Irish land area is let on land on tenancies for more than 5 years, which is really quite good comparatively compared to us. But it's the issue of mindset. This is my land. I want the flexibility and the control that comes with ownership. But actually, I could earn more money by being broader minded about it and have it being better looked after. And it's that question of mindset. We keep coming back, as Henry picked up earlier on, we keep coming back to people. And it's shifting attitudes in people.
Well, Rob, I'm going to let you in a moment, but since you're coming back, I'll take an opportunity to ask you a question, Jeremy. If you were going to start your own business at this point on land, and you were talking about this great change and to potentially to specialization, diversification, adding value, all these sorts of things. And you say you were able to get hold of any bit of land you wanted, so there was no constraint on that. What sort of business would you start?
I think, well, because the answer to that is, firstly, if I had the great business idea, would I be announcing it on this call?
Well, let's assume that you've got quite happy where you are.
So therefore, in the absence of the great business idea that I'm not going to divulge on this call, no, you are playing to your own strengths as an individual. I think I would remark. And I go back to one of the Oxford conferences where at the Young Farmers meeting, people are all asked, have you thought very hard about your marketplace? And have you thought about what people will want to buy? To which they all, of course, dutifully said yes. And then the next question that the audience was asked was, well, how many of you are now growing vegetables? And of course, overwhelmingly, a lot of this discussion does tend to focus on people who want to rear one way or another, rear and bring on livestock. And actually, you are and I'm not at this point in the business of talking down the future of livestock, but I am in the business of talking up the prospective public appetite for a greater vegetable content in their diet, or fruit or vegetable. And I expect the Dimbleby report will come out with things like this later in the year. And the ability for people to produce smaller, more highly specialized, and probably more added value opportunities in those areas is probably not to be underrated. I think you come back to the challenge I threw out about scaling that up. If you like, running a box scheme for a village is great, but does that really earn you an income for life? And it's thinking further and beyond that. But that's where I think we will see more. In the way that dairy farms used to produce. I'm not again suggesting that dairy farms should necessarily do it now, but very significant fraction of dairy farms produced butter to be sold off the farm before we went in for subsidies, or indeed cheese, or indeed cider, or all the various ways in which food was preserved so that it was available around the year. But looking at ways at which you can do something that gives you a higher margin that you can hold in the marketplace. So some of that's what you're doing, some of it's branding, if you can do that. But it's the core of the reason why there is not the answer that I'm going to give you to your question is actually, it lies in the person doing it. They've got to like, enjoy, believe in that idea and go the extra mile.
Brilliant. Okay. Thanks, Jeremy. I'm sorry you didn't give us your brilliant business idea, but there you go. Rob, what was your question?
I'd just like to ask Jeremy, I mean, I know the Irish scheme about allowing rental income not to be taxed effectively up to certain thresholds, depending on terms, looks very attractive as an encouraged land onto the market. I mean, in the UK, there's been a lot of talk about capital taxes preventing people disposing of land or changing use of land. You know, at the same hand, is one way or the other, is tax reform needed to drive part of that availability of land and doing things?
Well, I'm going to stay with the income tax reform because I think that's something that's got a proven track record of shifting something in an economy that is very, very close to ours. Indeed, as we were told only 100 years ago, was part of the United Kingdom, and very similar in terms of its underlying land law and the rest. I'm very wary about doing too much with capital taxation. That is, on the evidence of the 1970s here, far more likely to frighten the horses. Some of the ideas that are around about withdrawing some of the reliefs unless you let for more than 10 years, I think raise really quite challenging problems. The modelling I've done suggests there are too few tenancies that would be encouraged to go up to 10 years and more, and far more that would be driven shorter or out of letting into the arrangements you were discussing, because of such an arrangement, this is an area where people are very rapidly frightened of the of change, and they would want to retain flexibility to the disadvantage of the system. In the main, the issues around capital taxation, again, though are quite frequently overblown. We've got full relief on land. The importance of agricultural property relief is for let land. If I'm farming in hand, even using arguably using contracting businesses, I qualify for business property relief, which is full on market value. What agricultural property relief gives is less than people think on the can, but it gives an assurance on renting land out, and of course for farming families it gives some protection on the farmhouse. But
I wonder whether, not necessarily inheritance tax, but the interaction with CGT, where you get CGT uplift on death, clouds people's minds, in that if I hold on to this land and die, nobody ever pays any tax on it. If there was no CGT uplift, which has been proposed by both the OTS, IHT and CGT reviews, then if I'm an old farmer and I know that at the end of the day I can leave it to my kids, there's no inheritance tax, but if they sell it, there's tax. Why don't I leave it to my kids now? If there's no difference between a life and a death transfer, does that mean that older people are happier passing land down generations or doing different things with it because it's not as critical to do things? And if they pass it into the next generation and you've got 3 kids owning 200 acres, do they say, do you know what, we'll either flog it or we'll rent it out long term because we're not interested in farming it ourselves? Whereas dad still dog and sticks it till he pops his clogs.
Well, as you say, the OTS has put this argument forward, and we wait to see where they go. I think with capital gains tax, there's a whole lot else comes with that about the need to rebase and how you handle inflation and one thing and another. But I think I'm really coming back to the point here that I'm not trying to tackle who owns what land how. I'm trying to tackle who gets the use of the land in the most productive way. And I think there's an argument in what you say to be debated. I just feel it's not necessarily where the centre ground of the issue is, and there is a powerful urge in many rural landowning families just to say, well, we'll let the next generation sort it. If they don't, rather than make a decision now. I mean, one of the morals I'm trying to explain to people is that we are conceivably in as benign a tax environment as you could realistically imagine at the moment. So holding off for a better one is not something that's rational.
No.
But inertia is a hell of a motive.
Thanks, Rob. Graham sort of mentioned something that I'll pick up on. I think it's interesting. Is a move away from livestock by cut out the middle animal and create proteins directly from land. And I know in Aberystwyth there have been trials of growing on pasture land grasses, etc., which you can then bioreact into various proteins, etc. Is that a sort of direction, do you think, as well as vegetables, but also plant-based proteins? Yeah, sorry, I was using vegetables very, very, very broadly, and not intending you just to think of have a carrot in your mind. But yes, I mean, all these things are possibly there. When I looked at Graham's question in the chat box, I had as much thinking that this was also about restoration of soils and so on as part of that management on that side. But people will look for where they can earn an honest shilling effectively, and preferably where it will have a commercial margin attached to it. And that's the nub of the challenge. And again, the answer to your earlier question, it is finding, winning, and holding a commercial margin. And some of that means finding ways round the British food system, where margin has largely been wrung out of the system. How do you find ways round the food? What do you mean? Well, I think interestingly, that's more or less exactly what this last year has seen people do. The shift
away from the food service sector appears to have seen more meat, just to stay on the positive side here for meat, just to use that, but I think you can make the case more broadly, has seen more meat sold domestically through more ordinary retail outlets, and people favouring the butcher and the greengrocer for all of this. And people have had, where they've gone for that, have had the prices that go with it. It was put to me some time ago in a nice pithy little phrase that the processors squeezed the farmer's margin, the supermarket squeezed the processor's margin, and then they cannibalised their own margins. And what went, and that's, if you like, a very crude and rather brutal description of about 80% of the UK food market. And it's finding ways around that, or having something that's special enough that you can hold value despite the power of the buyer. And I can think back to a lunch I had with one maker of one particular added value product, who, because it's got a geographical perspective, is the only maker of that product in that geography. He doesn't have a problem dealing with supermarkets. They don't have anywhere else to go.
I'm told also that berry producers and soft fruit have a strong position when dealing with supermarkets as well.
Yeah, everybody will feel their vulnerabilities.
Right, I'm going to sort of close up. Kate, I'm going to leave yours because it's more about the scheme and so forth from this stage. I think we'll come back to that later. But I'd like to thank Jeremy very much for giving his time and his huge experience and wisdom to help us think, because I think this idea of what is a successful business, what are the sort of ideas that new entrants can bring and that we can help support are absolutely crucial. And I think that's given a lot of very useful material for thought. And hope you will come back to our future talks. Our next one is quickly looking up the system. Actually, we're still sort of gathering descriptions and chasing people. So if you're one of the people giving talks and you're being chased for descriptions and things, please give it to us. So at the moment, actually, our future program is a bit sparse on details, but we are chasing people and beating them around the head to try and get them to give us more stuff to put up, and we'll be working on that, and we'll be informing you. You can also follow on the Eventbrite, so you'll get updates and so on. So the next one is next Wednesday with Xavier Hammond and Simon Platten, and we will add some further details ASAP to that. Actually, Catherine, are you here at the moment?
Yeah, I'm still here.
Can you give us a little more information about what that is about, that event is about?
Yeah, I'm just going to update the page. So if people look at it in the next few minutes, it will be updated.
But what's the topic, just quickly? We've got Simon Platten is Tamar Grow Local, and Xavier Hamon is Land Workers Alliance. So is it their sort of model for support?
Yeah, Simon's actually on the call. Oh, I think.
Sorry, if I may just interrupt, I could speak briefly about what I'll talk about next week. It's the Farm Start Network and helping new entrants to access land on an easy in, easy out rental basis.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Simon. So hopefully you can join us for another stimulating talk. And thanks again, Jeremy. And there is a way to sort of clap on this system, isn't there? If we understood, you can do a reaction. Wait, I found it. Okay. Thank you very much all, and see you next Wednesday. Okay. Cheers then. Bye.